slides actually work as they should. Fantastic. Maybe I'll move on this side. Nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Giulio. I'm a researcher at the University of Cambridge, where I mainly work on AI and information ecosystems. So I focus on understanding really how AI shapes and changes the way we acquire information, we process information, and what that means for society. A couple of years ago, here in this conference, I gave a talk about AI and sort of like democracy and showed like some of my research. And this year, I thought I would do something a little bit different and really like also to connect to the previous talk, to sort of like think about the questions and like where we headed next and have a more like speculative talk about like what's happening to us and where are we headed. So I decided to call this AI and the future of truth. Truth is obviously a very loaded and complicated concept, but yeah, so we'll go through this in a minute. Let's see if this works. Nope. Yeah, maybe I'll just do it manually. No. Sorry. Okay, maybe. Yeah, I have to do it manually. Okay. Well, I think the first point to discuss is basically how AI is or has been breaking this what we call the realism barrier. So in the past, content generation used to be largely like analogic or manual. Content had to be generated like slowly and carefully. But this has been changing basically since 2022. So at the beginning, we got the first, like, the beginning of photorealistic images. So think of models like DALL-E 2 or Midjourney. These were not perfect images, but they were starting to approach a point where it was quite similar to what was credible, at least to some humans. Obviously, these modalities kept developing. In 2023, we started getting like pretty fluent text and voice generation with AI. Thinking about 11 Labs, I think it's probably the most well-known example. Basically, this led to like some voice cloning at scale. 2024, it was the year of video. 2024 and then 2025, we started getting VO, Sora, so models that can create like extremely realistic videos. And then now we're edging into the era of more real-time interactive interactions like avatars or conversational synthesis. So this is all to say that we're approaching a point where a lot of the content that we see is AI-generated and a lot of it is of pretty good quality. So this boundary of what is obviously synthetic, which was something that was easier to detect a few years ago, is approaching a point where the majority of humans, even experts, really struggle to know what is AI generated. And there's multiple studies that have shown that even for experts, it's often basically a coin toss to know whether an image or other piece of media is AI generated. I thought I showed some images from like recent research that we carried out at Cambridge on basically high-risk synthetic images, so context with like high-stakes implications. And we basically generated a lot of AI images for this study. And you can kind of see that we approached the point where you can create all sorts of type of content, like satellite images or medical imagery or images that have to do with like political gathering or elections. So we're approaching a point where we really have really high capability of creating misleading content at scale, at a point where it's just hard for us and for humans to know whether something is real or not. Very importantly, synthetic content now spans basically every modality. So we have text. So like text is probably the hardest modality for us to detect because knowing whether text is AI generated is close to impossible at this point. Then AI spanned into audio. So we have, again, like voice cloning from just samples of like seconds of sample. We now have videos and we have images. So we're at a point where every modality is basically extremely developed in AI generated content. And very important, and this is something that we see a lot in like the real world. Like if you study, I don't know, misinformation campaign during elections, you see a lot of hybrid content. So content that is like a bit of AI with a bit of human, and you have like real footage with like some synthetic patches. Maybe you have like AI overlays on real images. So it gets really hard because detection has to find basically a needle that is like evidence, in evidence is like part real, part not. And it's just getting like incredibly hard to do, especially at scale. This is particularly important for high-stake processes, and this is where a lot of my research goes, in a way. So we really focus on like high-stakes, very important societal processes. The one that we focus on the most is elections. So we try to understand how AI impacts elections. And elections have been impacted a lot by the rise of AI-generated content. You have synthetic robocalls, where the most famous one was it's known as the Biden robocall in the latest US elections, where basically AI-generated Biden robocalls were used to try and like mislead voters. You have fabricated endorsement. You have all sorts of manipulation. Another area that I work on a lot is emergency response. So how AI-generated content can be used to disrupt emergency responses, which is something that we tend to not think about a lot, but emergency response is quite a fragile sector in many ways, and having trustworthy and reliable communication in this case is extremely important, and AI can sort of like muddy the water in these cases. Another very interesting one is financial markets, because those are all areas where we tend to need to move quite quickly without a lot of time to verify and think about whether information is real or not. And financial markets are the obvious case study here, especially with, you've probably seen the recent rise of AI agents that can go online and trade and talk to each other. So that's also like sort of like different tier of these like high-stake processes and how they're impacted by AI. An important point that kind of like underlies the framing here is that when you think about AI-generated content, offense tends to move faster than defense. For those of you who are familiar with cybersecurity, this is probably like it's often the case. But this means that our defenses tend to get quite overwhelmed. And that's because basically flooding an information ecosystem is extremely cheap. Like if you want to create millions and millions of posts and just like flood an information space, you can do it quite quickly. Detecting that content is incredibly difficult and expensive. Like in the past couple of years, we've worked on multiple projects on detection, and doing that is really complex and, again, expensive and not very scalable. And each new generation of generative models seem to leave detection one step behind. So we usually get good detection for the previous generation, not so much for the current one, which obviously creates a whole set of complications for security of information ecosystems. And then again, the typical mantra that defenders need to get it right in every case, while attackers basically only need to land the attack once, which means that offensive AI tends to be like often ahead of defensive AI. This is just like a conceptual visualization of that. So why does truth matter? I think this is like a normal question to ask, is that why do we care about all of this? And I think we sometimes forget how shared epistemic grounds is really the substrate for everything else that happens in society. Think of democracy, like deliberation really collapses if we don't have shared facts. When you have elections where we don't know what's real, we don't know what isn't, and we've probably seen a couple of those already, it is very difficult to have like healthy social and political processes. Coordination, like if you think of markets, crisis responses, or supply chains, like all those things rely on having trustworthy information. That doesn't need to be necessarily like top-down information, but it needs to be a link of trust in the system. The justice system is also an example that I wanted to mention, because it is increasingly seen that like courts and all kinds of accountability processes rely on trust. You need authentic evidence. You need evidence that people trust to be real. And those are just some examples of why, as a society, we do need to be able to agree and have like clear processes to understand what truth is. Okay, so what does this all mean for the like future of truth in this era of AI-generated content? So in the past couple of years, I've worked a lot on like tools and really understanding what can we do as a society to understand this space better and really like protect society from this massive change that we're seeing. And what I found is that basically every tool, like we have multiple approaches, and all of them have a lot of very evident shortcomings. Again, I mentioned detection before, and detection, some people are really think that detection at some point will catch up and scale, but at this point, detection is always lagging behind. And again, we have the problem with quantity, where detecting is always harder than generating. And then each model generation tends to outpace like the previous one. We have watermarking, which is probably the most promising technical approach, like we've seen, for example, SynthID by Google, which is a great watermark. But again, those are largely voluntary. We have a fragmented ecosystem where you have a lot of different approaches, like C2PA. So you have all of these really nice tools, but they don't really work well together. That means that we don't have an ecosystem where if you go online, you have any reliable way of knowing whether something is AI or not. Then we have regulation. So regulation, as you probably all know, it tends to be quite slow. It takes months, sometimes years to do something. And with AI, we always have this problem with policymakers that AI is one technology that just moves so fast. Like every generation just moves incredibly fast to the point where you're regulating something that it's probably already obsolete. And the last one is literacy, because I'm a scholar largely in like misinformation studies, and we always talk about media literacy. But also, on the other hand, we do see very often that media literacy doesn't really scale for this kind of thing. At some point, individual judgment will cap out, and that is something to think about. Like, I think we all like to think that when we see an AI-generated video or image, we can tell whether it is AI-generated. But I think we'll have to accept that at some point that will stop, and that will just cap out, and we will not be able to know anymore. And at that point, we will need good infrastructure to actually think how to adapt. So basically, in my research, I came to this moment where I was like, okay, we're facing a strategic choice here because the AI field is very divided. In one way, we have like, do we resist this progress? Do we push for moratoria? Do we push for limits? Do we try to restrict capabilities of deployment? Do we basically try to contain this progress for the sake of defending these very important societal processes? Or do we try and adapt to this new treacherous and complicated information landscape? So we take this technology as something that exists. So the AI revolution has happened. Synthetic content is everywhere. So we should build these institutions, the norms, infrastructure for a world where information just flows differently. It just works differently from what it did until a few years ago, where authentication was largely possible. And as a society, we still had more solutions that we have today. And I think that is a very important shift, especially in like the public debate or mostly the academic debate. But I think it's very important to accept that probably society will never be the same from an information perspective, and we really need to think, how do we move forward from here? So if no single tool wins, nothing really works. So what does this adaptation actually look like in practice? So these are three ideas that I've worked on in the past in many different ways. And I'm really thinking of an ecosystem where you have multiple tools working at the same time, where we start like adapting as a society. The first, which is something that I'm personally obsessed with in academic terms, is adjudication infrastructure. So using crowdsourced verification at scale. So think community nodes, think Wikipedia. So basically distributing deliberation where maybe a single human cannot tell whether something is AI generated, but if you scale that intelligence with basically principles from crowdsourcing, you can get to a point where maybe that intelligence does scale up. And I'll actually show some evidence on that at the end of the presentation. Then we have provenance and watermarking, again, cryptographic signatures like C2PA or SynthID or content credentials. So creating an ecosystem where that becomes the norm. For that to become the norm, we do need interoperable regimes. I think one of the main challenges that we have today in the AI space is that everything is just spread out and broken down. So Google has great watermarking technology, and so does OpenAI, but they don't communicate with each other. Obviously, if an image is created on Gemini, it has a SynthID watermark, but all others cannot. For example, if you create an image on ChatGPT, that doesn't have a SynthID watermark. So we have a very fragmented ecosystem. And I think every future adaptation will have to focus on interoperability. So having systems that are open, they're transparent, they're explainable, and they work well with each other. So none of these are enough, but maybe together they give us like a good starting point to form a more resilient and adapted society to synthetic content. But where are we today in this process? So adjudication infrastructure is surprisingly popular. It's mature and expanding. We have community nodes. We have Wikipedia. We have like multiple social media platforms that use like individual trust signal as kind of like crowdsourcing signals. Provenance and watermarking, again, is emerging. So we have some standards that are quite good, but adoption is very fragmented, and compliance is largely voluntary. I mean, it's completely voluntary. There's no country, at least in the EU, that has established like watermarking or provenance standards. Interoperability is still quite bad at the moment. Article 50 of the EU AI Act mandates interoperability, but no one knows exactly how that will be applied. And we're still really not there. So that seems the area where we still need more understanding and more thinking about like how do we make that work in the future. Okay, so I thought I would add some of my, probably the most recent paper that I worked on, which tries to answer this question of, is society actually adapting to this shift? And the evidence is yes, and kind of like faster than we thought. So this is a study where we downloaded the full data set of community nodes, and then we identified every node where users were contesting whether something was AI or not. And particularly, we focus on the subsample where people were disagreeing on whether something was AI. So the same tweet had a note saying this is AI and a note saying this is not AI. So we basically identified all the contested tweets that we can find on community nodes. And what we saw was this very interesting distribution that we defined as a curve with a shock phase and an adaptation phase. So the shock phase basically goes from late 2020, sorry, that's the wrong x-axis, but it goes from 2021 until like 2024, like Q3 2024. And from that point onwards, we actually see this adaptation where the rate of contestation starts going down, kind of like telling us that people are disputing less whether something is AI generated, and they're actually agreeing much more often. So we found way less tweets that have this like contested information. Again, this is not definitive evidence. This is sort of like still work in progress, and we're still trying to understand like what is happening here exactly. But I think it's an interesting initial evidence that maybe online platforms are adapting to this new phenomenon, and we're kind of, maybe we're agreeing on specific contestation rules, and we're just getting better at it. And the disputes themselves are getting less strong. So even when contestation does occur, it's becoming less polarized over time. So this is what we defined as the disagreement intensity. So we looked at how intensely people disagreed on those tweets. And we see that in the shock period, the disagreement intensity was higher than in the stabilization period. And this is continuing to basically decrease over time. So we're seeing that people are disagreeing less, and they're also disagreeing less strongly. So we probably have some evidence of converging norms, and this is something that we saw as quite promising, maybe not conclusive evidence, but it is something showing that maybe there's something happening there, and we're already like adapting a little bit, and maybe it goes against the most like doomerist narratives on AI-generated content online. So what are these three principles for the next decade? And as I was writing this, I thought like maybe next decade is a bit of a long shot. Maybe this will be for the next like couple years, given pace of AI development. But I think the takeaway is that no single tool will be sufficient. Like we need to stop focusing on individual tools and really need to think from an ecosystem perspective, what does a society that has accepted synthetic media and synthetic content look like? And the future is probably an ecology of these overlapping systems that can work with each other in an interoperable way and actually give us this kind of like adaptation to synthetic media and synthetic content that we like. The second point, which is something that, again, I'm very interested in, is to build this adjudication infrastructure and treat the truth as something that is more deliberative in a way, where you have like crowdsourcing verification and really trying to understand whether these individual judgments can scale and can improve our like collective capability to detect what is synthetic or not. And then this the last takeaway is that adaptation seems real. Like we're actually seeing online platforms adapting, at least from early evidence. So this is important. I think we should not waste it because I think communities are responding faster than predicted. When we first worked on that study, I was very surprised. Like I didn't think that you would already see that kind of like distribution already going down and seeing like less contestation. So I think that's important. I think we should really focus on designing systems that compound and work with that adaptation rather than fight it. And I think, yeah, this is the last slide. So sort of like the open question with all of this is, can we keep like adapting and stabilizing as AI capabilities scale? Because I think that is always the hardest question when you're working on AI and AI-generated content, that things seem to move so quickly that whatever you consider a fact today may just like not be true in the next few months. So I think we're left this open question of like, will this trend continue? How will can we actually adapt as AI capabilities continue to scale? If AI capabilities continue to scale, which, again, we also don't know, really. And I think I'll just stop here. So thanks, everyone. And if you have any questions or anything, please grab me or just drop me an email.
Thank you so much. Thank you. You're so precise. You finished exactly on time, but it was so interesting. I will allow one question from the audience. Who's going to be the lucky lady or gentleman? Yeah, that was lightning quick. Yeah, it's yours.
I actually looked around to see if anybody would beat me, but curious about the stabilization. I think adaptation is probably a net good. Can we draw any epistemic conclusions about the stabilization phase? In other words, is there less disagreement because they're better at predicting the content, or are they just disagreeing less, but they still have no idea what's real?
Yes, so I think that is a great question and something that we asked ourselves a lot because obviously that is an explanation. Like we also thought that maybe people just gave up, like maybe they just like stopped contesting because they don't believe that it's useful anyway to do it. So I think there's many explanations there from an epistemics perspective. I think it was still interesting to see that ultimately there was less disagreement. Whenever there were disagreements, they were less strong. So for us that was a positive, but I think yes, that was like the main limitation there, that we don't know whether all these alternative explanations hold. And then we had some like evidence that we want to work in the future to try and understand that, which means basically like diving into the data like more qualitatively and try to really understand. But no, there are definitely like more explanations there, and some of them are sadder than this, which could be that people just like have lost part of their willingness to fight on that.